Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today we are going to talk about The Reign of the Phallus, written by Eva Keuls, and it's going to be discussed today by Sheila Jeffries and me, Jo Brew. Now let me show Sheila. So here's Sheila and me, and we're going to be doing the talk, and this is the book that we're talking about. So welcome everybody who's here. This is the book we're going to talk about, The Reign of the Phallus by Eva Keuls. I'm going to do a short introduction and then hand over to Sheila, who will continue. So welcome everybody who's here. Thank you so much for coming. And I'll start to introduce the book. Let me get this. So the book is called The Reign of the Phallus. It's by Eva Keuls, and it was published in 1985, and it was published by the University of California Press, Berkeley. It's very widely available on a range of different platforms, so you should be able to get a copy of it. It was republished, and it's quite a well-known book, although sort of being covered up to some extent as well. So we're going to talk about that a bit. The book uses evidence using mostly images that were from ancient Greek vases to investigate the lives of women in Athens, and it focuses on 5th century BC, when its phallocracy, so the reign of the phallus or the penis, was, in Keuls' words, severe and crass. So it was very, very extreme sort of penile situation or promotion of the penis, but it was also crass. It was very open and it was very clear. They didn't hide what they were doing because they were sort of unsophisticated, she said. So this slide here shows an Amazon who were mythological. They were sort of created part of the founding Athenian story of who Athens was, what Athens was in the 5th century BC. This is from a vase, and it shows an Amazon aiming her spear at the genitals of a Greek warrior. Keuls says this is this sort of image of Athenian women, or sorry, Amazonian women who were fighters, threatening male genitals, was a foundational myth of Athenian society. That means it was the most important foundational myth of the threat posed by women. She writes about this image: a feisty female warrior, identified as the Amazon queen Hippolyte, aims her spear at the exposed genitals of a naked Greek man, probably Theseus, who was Athens' national hero. To a male viewer, these scenes seem to say women threaten our manhood and need to be subjugated to prevent them from rebelling against us. So the next slide here, we have, as part of this myth that explains the beginning, or the height of Athenian power at this time, is Heracles killing an Amazon. And in both of these two pots, it shows the male hero killing the Amazon. Now, thousands of these images have been found, and they're one of the most significant. They're on statues, they're on vases, they're on the Parthenon in Athens. This killing of the Amazon being very, very important part of Athenian culture. And Keuls says, not infrequently, the killer plunges his weapon into his opponent's breast near a nipple, sort of showing the sexualized violence and the male over female power. Now, in the book, she reproduces 345 images from cups, mosaics, statues, and monuments. And these images come from private collections, art galleries such as the Louvre, the Vatican, the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. Keuls had funding from Princeton, the National Endowment for Humanities in States, that's another place, and the University of Minnesota to pay for her time, travel, and the cost of illustrations. So this was 1985 that the book was published. And it was published by a very big university press, the University of California Press. Now, in chapter 2, she says that the images which she's showing us are a form of pictorial propaganda. And so people would see these on the cups, and they were a way of creating a national identity for Athens. And the national identity was, at that time in the 5th century, was very, very aggressively imperialistic. They were taking control of the other Athenian or Greek states, but it was also bound up with a very, very much violence against women and against their own women. Now, she says that there are stories that are part of myth that created and can help us understand what Athens was. So there are countless stories of clubbing, stabbing, strangling to death of sundry animals and monsters. Secondly, there are manifold tales of rape, a theme in which no other mythology has been as rich as the Attic meaning Athenian. So they had loads and loads and loads of rape stories. The mythological rape is normally of a mortal female by a male divinity or a hero. And the third category was tales of goddesses who could not or would not bear children, and the stories of male motherhood. So we'll talk about that later. So part of the foundational structure of Athens at that time was male motherhood, in which offspring are born from parts of the male anatomy or directly from the male semen. So people like Aristotle, that the philosopher, said that, sort of argued that the women were basically a sort of empty box that looked after the male generative principle. Then we've looked at this, we're looking at this charter myth, as Keuls calls it, is the killing of the Amazons, so the destruction of female resistance. And I'll just show the next slide. So those were the parts. So at this time in the 5th century, there was a lot of phallic imagery, and there were a lot of phalluses all over the place. So here, just unbelievably, there's this monumental phalluses of Delos, which is a sort of place in Greece. Now, there were shrines to phalluses, and then in this picture, you can image 71 is a phallus carried through the town. So there were phalluses everywhere, all over the place. Now, this is as well as explaining what she's doing, Keuls gives us a question at the beginning of the book, and then the book deals with it and helps us answer it. And I'm going to read you the question that she puts. During the summer of 1415 BC, Athens was shaken by a scandal that roughly coincided with the launching of the boldest Greek military effort since the Trojan War. A group of conspirators moving through the city under the cover of night mutilated the statues of the god Hermes. Now, there's pictures of the statues, which are also phalluses, and these were all over the city. And she writes, found in every neighborhood and in front of the private dwellings, as well as in public places, these statues had the shape of plain rectangular columns, except for two carved features, the head and the erect genitals. When Athens awakened, almost all of these phallic sculptures had been castrated. This highly symbolic crime is remarkable because of the authorities' failure, despite extreme measures, to discover who committed it, and because of the political, social, and cultural matrix within which the scandal arose. And then here we've got in these pictures a couple of images of these Hermes, they were called. So these are the sort of towers or structures that were outside many houses in the domestic sphere. There were some indoor ones, outdoor ones, and all over Athens at the time. So this was the key question: who castrated the Hermes in 1415? So it's a great book, really interesting, and also there's a whodunit in it. There's much more to say, but I'm going to now hand over to Sheila Jeffries, who's going to give another sort of depth and some ideas about the book. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and over to you, Sheila. Sheila, you're muted.
Hello, everyone. Can I say, before I move on, I just want to make a comment about the Amazon stuff. As I understand it, back in the day when, of course, as feminists in the 1970s, we were really, really interested in Amazons and all of this stuff. As I understand it, feminist anthropologists at that time, and Kathleen may know more about this, did point out that in South American countries as well, there were Amazon myths. This is in tribal communities in South America. And the understanding was that these communities had myths about how dreadful women had actually ruled over them at one time, how awful they were, how they made a terrible mess of it, etc. And the men had to take over. They had to take over by force in order to create order and control this terrible disorder that women had created. So it does seem that the myth that once there were women in charge and they made a terrible mess of it is much more general than just in Athens and in Greece. And although I know there are quite a lot of women who would like to think that the Amazons were real in some way, the fact that these myths existed in other places is fascinating in feminist terms, but does not suggest that the Amazons actually existed, but rather that, amazingly, different times and different places in the world, men had to invent these myths in order to justify their existence. And I think that's really interesting, actually. So to go on to the book, now, I didn't see the book until, Kathleen's already saying there's a Joan Bamberger essay about it. That will be the one I know, and that's where I got these ideas from. So thank you, Kathleen. Now, when I read the book, that was when I got the second edition, which was 1993. I didn't read it originally in 85, but I absolutely loved the book. And I absolutely loved it because it was just so amazing to me, and it and spoke to my whole experience of having been an ancient historian and so on. But I'll talk about that in a moment. But first of all, let's just say that a book with the title The Reign of the Phallus is extremely unlikely to be published now. I mean, can you imagine? Everybody would think you were ridiculous and sort of titter and cover their faces with, if you had a book that even had that title now. So we have to remember that in the mid-1980s was the great period of feminist scholarship. We've never seen anything like this before, when actually all sorts of academics were writing about stuff, and they were writing angrily and forcefully and doing wonderful work. And Jo has actually looked up Eva Keuls, and it looks as if she didn't do feminist stuff after this. So this was her great feminist work. Everybody was doing feminist work at that time. A lot of feminist academics then sort of went back into the woodwork, and we didn't hear from them again. They joined their sort of male stream track, as it were. So, I mean, my book, my next book is called Penile Imperialism, which is, of course, a very similar title. And rather surprising today. People are rather surprised by that today. It wouldn't have been surprising at all in 1985, but it is surprising today because you're not supposed to say it. It's a little bit rude to talk about the penis and so on. And indeed, I had a lot of trouble getting that book published, which is not very surprising. Now, the book I see as enormously important for several reasons. The first reason is that Athens provided the model for Western democracy, which I'm sure we are all very, very aware of, and not just those of us who did Latin at our nice girls' schools once upon a time, as of course I did, and all the sort of history of Rome and Athens and things for the first few years of my education, as you know, the very model, the very model. In fact, of course, in Athens, there were only 5,000 male citizens who had citizenship in any sense in which we would understand it. They were able to go and stand on a hilltop and raise their hands when there were questions. And so in that sense, they were part of a democracy. The vast majority of the residents were slaves. And the women of the citizen class in fact, lived in slave conditions. And in fact, Aristotle at one point talked about, was there really a difference between women and slaves, and had a little sort of argument with himself about it. So the women absolutely took no part in the vaunted democracy. The women of the citizen class were secluded within the house. They were mostly not allowed to go out, not unless they were old, and so on. Now, the second reason that the book is so amazing and important is that Athens, of course, created the glorious spaces, so-called, for Western culture and philosophy. And in fact, of course, Athens was founded upon and spoke of brutal warfare and brutal slavery. So it's really, really not a very good example. And the third reason it's important, the third thing it overthrows, is the idea that Athens was a model for homosexuality and how homosexuality could be. I mean, for a couple of centuries now, gay men have promoted the idea that, Athens was the pinnacle for homosexuality. It was accepted, they could be out and open, and it was loved, a band of lovers going into war would win, and all that sort of stuff. Whereas in fact, of course, the most homosexual sex in Athens was with boy children, pre-pubertal, or with slaves. So actually this pinnacle of homosexuality is very much not. It's actually about child abuse. So I think that's really, really important to know, because I don't know whether it's still going on. Is it still going on? But certainly, in the 70s and 80s, gay liberation, and the men, the philosophers, the historians were all going on about Athens being, just absolutely wonderful. That's where it was at, So, overturning the classical and traditional view of history was very important to us in the 1970s because of what we'd all been taught. In the late 1960s, I did a history degree at the University of Manchester, starting in 1966, which consisted of 3 years. So the first year was sort of ancient history, Dark Ages, then it was the sort of Tudor type period, and then it was modern history and so on. And that's the way you did it. You had to learn everything, and you did the philosophy and politics of those times as well. And so I was doing ancient history in 1966. And women weren't mentioned, of course. I mean, why would they have been? And there wasn't feminism, and I didn't question that. And then in my third year, I did a special subject in Greek and Roman citizenship. That didn't mention the subordinate status of women either. So, I mean, they simply weren't there. It was never mentioned. And then when I became a feminist a few years later, it was the great age of feminist history, and women were being put back into history. And in the 1980s, I was involved in the feminist history group and the lesbian history group in London. And in the feminist history group, we wrote a book called The Sexual Dynamics of History, Men's Power and Women's Resistance. That came out in 83. And so everything was being reinvestigated and rewritten at that time. And we were horrified that Athens was held up as the cradle of Western democracy. We understood that no women were allowed to be citizens, not even the wives of citizens themselves. But in Keuls' book, that's not exactly what she's saying. She talks about citizen wives, i.e. the wives of men who were citizens. But the women were entirely excluded from the public world. And she does explain in the book that men's lives were very much outside and in public. And she explains that the women were entirely excluded from that public world. So men had massive public buildings, all with columns, and they had gymnastics outside and debating outside and the market outside and so on and so on. Women were not allowed into any of that. They weren't allowed in the legal system at all. They couldn't do anything in the legal system. They simply weren't recognized. And they simply weren't really actually allowed outside the women's quarters of the house. I mean, interestingly, reading this book again now, it makes me think very much of Afghanistan, because a lot of the situation of women is very similar to the situation of women in Afghanistan. For instance, the prostitution of boy children, which has always been huge in Afghanistan, the seclusion of women, the exclusion of girls from education because citizen women were not allowed any kind of education, they weren't allowed to read, and so on. Was all very much similar, although of course the society of Afghanistan is not made up entirely of slaves, or almost entirely of slaves. And now so the book was written into a context, and this is of course why it was written, I guess, where there was huge interest in upturning the conventional patriarchal view of history. And it does that job very, very well for ancient Athens, and it concentrates on the period, the 6th to the 4th centuries BC. So it starts in the 6th century and moves up to the 4th century BC. Now, the content of the vase paintings shows very plainly the mores of the time and how accepted and public they were, because as you know, Joe pointed out, there's a Herm outside every house, that all the cups have got this imagery on them and so on. Now, these days, of course, this material still exists, but it's pornography. And so it's not so prominent in public life. I mean, the millions and millions and millions of men use pornography every day. And so it's a huge part of their lives and an ordinary part of their lives, but it's not quite so polite to have those penises in public space. So there's a slight difference in the way that this hatred of women is, and the importance of the phallus is expressed. There's a little bit of propriety today in where the material can be shown. But women were of such low status in Athens that the material could dominate the culture, and there was no problem. So it would be a mistake, I think, to think that we do not live under the reign of the phallus now. And when you consider the ubiquity and the cruelty of pornography, I think we certainly do. But Athens was a little bit more sort of in your face. Now, the book's content was dynamite to me, because I thought, as someone who had studied ancient history, that I knew something about the subject. Indeed, in my first year at university, I won the first year history prize, for an essay about the patterns on Greek vases. Great, I should have known about this stuff. But the patterns on Greek vases that I was looking at were geometric patterns, and they were from 400 years before the Athenian supremacy that we're talking about here. So there were no penises. But the interesting thing is that I did lots of reading at that time, obviously, and you'd think that if these penises on vases were ever mentioned at all, I would have come across them. They were never mentioned. There was nothing in public space or in public history about any of this imagery, or I would have seen it. So there I was, innocently writing about geometric patterns. Now, the book covers the militarism of Athens, which Keuls sees as an integral aspect of the phallocracy. And it covers the relations between the sexes in Athenian mythology, as Joe pointed out. It covers the situation of the women who were the citizen wives and their seclusion in the home. And it covers the variety of ways in which women were used sexually in slavery and in prostitution, as well as the way men related to each other. And the chapter on homosexuality is absolutely fascinating. But it is important to remember that Keuls' sources were limited, because apart from vases and statuary, there was mythology, there were plays, there were plays, there were poetry, there were speeches and legal proceedings, but it's not easy to get an accurate vision of exactly what was taking place at the time. And Keuls does a very, very good job, though, of weaving all this together to create a social and political history of Athens. But interpretation can't be precise, and interpretation has changed very much over time. Apart from changing ideas on whether women could be citizens, there is, I think, potentially a major absence in the book, which is where the Athenian version of phallocracy came from. Keuls does mention that the status of women in the city-state of Sparta was extremely different at the time. If you can imagine where Sparta was, it was on the southeastern corner of the Peloponnese, and it's the area in the south of Greece that looks like an empty rubber glove with fingers. And Athens was, Sparta's down here. And Athens, of course, is up here, just before the rubber glove. And now it seems that in Sparta, women were allowed to take part in public life, and Sparta was less warlike. Women, in fact, in Sparta could even take part in gymnastics naked, which is certainly a very different situation from the situation in Athens. Now, when I was at university in the 60s, we were taught that there was an invasion from Asia of a more warlike peoples into Greece, and that led to the defeat of the Ionian peoples who became serfs of the Dorian peoples who invaded. Now, feminist scholars have related this to the defeat of a less warlike and patriarchal culture, particularly in Crete, which was some considerable time before 1200 BC, something like that. And Crete was very much focused on goddess worship, and women may not have been so oppressed in Greece. Now, the invasion might be related to the warlike nature of Athens, because that might reflect different people who came in, but it happened hundreds of years earlier than the period we're looking at here. However, in subsequent years, ideas have changed, and the invasion theory has been mostly abandoned. We did have an earlier radical feminist perspectives about the way in which in the 20th century, feminist research, particularly that of Maria Gimbutas, on the goddess culture in the Eastern Mediterranean was destroyed and hidden. So her work was hidden. I feel that Keuls' work has pretty much disappeared as well. I don't know much about how all these things are related. I'm not an ancient historian. The anthropologists here will probably know more than I do about these things. But certainly Keuls is concentrating on a culture much later than the goddess culture that Gimbutas writes about, much later. So today I'm going to concentrate on what Keuls says rather than the stuff that I don't know or don't know well enough. Okay, and I'll go back to you here, Jo.
I'm just going to share the screen, and I think what I'm going to show is this picture here. Now, let me also just get, yes, I think I need to, right. So in terms of the situation of women in the home, so their situation as the citizen women who were married to citizen males in Athens were kept really for breeding. They weren't allowed out, and there was only one door in these houses in the 5th century, and that door, which went out into the public sphere, was used by men to invite other men and prostitutes into the house. And that was the sort of the front room. So when they've done archaeology of which talks about, they find that the sort of better houses, the better part of the house was the front room. And that's where parties would happen, food would be eaten, and the men would bring prostitutes, which would be either the prostitute class of women who were enslaved women who were used for sex, and also sort of trained to be attractive sexually. So things like they were good at dancing, quite a lot of them were, or they were good at singing or talking, some of them. But the women who were used for breeding new male citizens were kept really at home. Now, this is a picture of a wife eating and drinking by herself in the women's quarters. So the women would be kept in the back rooms. There was no way out. There was only one door out. So they had to go through the men's quarters. They had to provide the food for these prostitute parties. And they also spent a lot of time doing domestic chores. So they weren't just breeding tools. They were also allowed to do spinning and weaving, but that weaving was kept to a minimum because that was a bit too creative. So they did a lot of spinning, they did cooking, and they were sort of often quite isolated. Now, I'm just going to oh, yes. So that was the situation they were in. Now, the women, when they got older, oh, no, I'll just tell you that the women were generally married off very, very young. So the general average age to get married was 14 or 15. And the man that she married, who was a citizen man, would be about 30. Now, he would have already had a lot of sexual experience with when he was a boy, he will have been sort of raped or had sex with older citizen men. Then when he was older, he would start going to these parties with prostituted women. And so he would have had huge amounts of sort of sexual experience. And by the time he got to 30, they would get a citizen, a girl of the citizen class, and they explicitly said they wanted them to be young and not know very much. That would be a better situation. So it's sort of known that they were doing that. So they were very much kept inside. Now, I'll just show you. So that's the situation of women a bit. Now, there was a sex appeal of female toil, and Keuls shows this in some of the images. So here we've got two pots, and at the top, she says molestation at the well, men harassing women sexually. Now, it's just fantastic that she did this work. She seemed to have been working, well, she clearly was in 1985 in a culture of feminism. She was very much aware and part of a community of women being able to do this feminist analysis, but it hadn't been done by anybody, any Greek scholars. So it was really sort of brilliant that she managed to look at the evidence and overlook what all the male scholars and the sort of male identified female scholars had said before her. She also managed to get this 345 images from all over the world and assess them and speculate about what's going on in the pictures. So it's a sort of really good analysis in a very creative way. Now, the bottom picture, she's showing satyrs molesting a woman at a water pump. Now, satyrs are this Greek mythological creature, which is sort of a man with horse legs, a horse tail, and a permanently erect penis. And they were meant to sort of symbolize the nature of males, an inner nature of males. And they were sort of also sort of grotesquely, it was meant to be a joke. But what Keuls says, which is interesting, is that they enjoyed the idea of women working the whole time, and that actually sort of sexually aroused them. They also had a lot of sort of mythology around this constant toil that women were meant to be doing. That was meant to be the role of women, is to work constantly, just absolutely. Now, this next slide shows some images of, this is from the chapter about homosexuality. Now, what she shows from these images is that the homosexuality was mostly pederastic, so paedophile, a grown man who was sort of 30 or older, who would have sex with young boys. Now, there was a bit of a taboo, Keuls says, on men having sex with other men. So that would be not the thing that was done. What they did sort of glorify and enjoy were mature man, and say in this one, 254, mature man with responsive child lover. And so this is sort of very, very obvious, and this has really been hidden from us. They haven't said, oh yes, by the way, they were paedophiles, when they glorify the sort of great homosexuality. in the same way that they don't say what they were actually doing to women. It wasn't that we were sort of hidden, or maybe rich wives just sort of having fun as part of the class. We were incredibly oppressed sort of class, either used to breed, or as slaves, or for sex. Now, look, the last bit I just want to add on, and then I'm going to hand back to Sheila after I've just told you about this one. So chapter 3, I'll go back to the picture of the woman so you can see this is talking about the woman. Chapter 3 talks about the situation of women, and it's entitled "The Phallus and the Box: The World Seen in the Shapes of Human Genitals." Now, what Keuls says is that a lot of the public life, that men were in public life, and it was very phallic, and their construction of their masculinity was based upon violence and sexualized violence, and their national identity was based upon that. And then women were seen as sort of boxes, and they lived in boxes in these hidden areas back with only one way out. When women were fertile, so until they reached menopause, they were basically not allowed out. And she does say a little bit in chapter 3 about what she thinks caused this, which is interesting, because she speculates about what caused this state of affairs. And she says that she does not think that there was a time of matriarchy before in Mediterranean culture. This is her speculation. She says power structures are rooted in brute strength. Women, smaller in stature, have always been weakened by menstruation and pregnancies, and decimated by that historical curse of the female sex, death in childbirth, which absolutely in Attica they were completely decimated. Many of them died, and there was a cult, which she talks about in another chapter, of death, so that women were sort of looking towards death in childbirth in the same way as the men were glorified if they died in fighting, in conquering other countries. Now, she says that she thinks a lot of the cause of the phallocracy was men's irrational fear of the female and his feelings of guilt, not his memory of a vanished world. So that's sort of interesting. And then she also says that bound up in some of this was there was phallic worship as a reaction in man's development in attempt to free himself from bondage to the female principle, and to canonize the penis as the fundamental generator of life, which is interesting. And then she says, again, which is why it's one of the reasons it's such a brilliant book, 5th century Attic culture is an excellent illustration of this process, because seldom has the function of respectable women been more drastically restricted to childbearing, and seldom did phallic worship coincide so clearly with manifestations of violence such as militarism, imperialist expansion, and brutality in the conduct of everyday affairs. So you can hear from that what a brilliant writer she is, and also that she's sort of speculating a bit about what she thinks happens. So I'm going to hand back to Sheila now and stop sharing the screen.
Thanks, Jo. Now, I'm going to talk about the central chapters of the book, which are mainly concerned with the prostitution of women. Now, I think that Keuls in her book doesn't make the prostitution system of Athens particularly clear, at least not as much as I would like. What I understand is that marriage in Athens was not about companionship and not seen as sexually interesting. The men did not want to have anything to do with their child brides apart from the creation of children. I mean, that's another interesting similarity with Afghanistan, where, of course, there were child brides and forced marriage and so on, and a husband would have several wives in his lifetime because the others would all die in childhood. Well, it's similar to that, of course, and expected to be similar to that in Athens. So yes, the men spent most of their time outside the house, and the girls they married were left in seclusion. But the women, there were women that the men did spend time with, and they were prostituted women. And the organized prostitution system in Athens is understood to have been introduced by the lawgiver Solon, as he was called, in the late 7th and 6th centuries. In other words, at the beginning of the period that is covered by this book. So it was in place in the period covered by this book. And he's famous for introducing public brothels at a fixed and affordable price to ensure the sexual welfare of men. So he was seen as a very good lawgiver because he really looked after the interests of the men in Athens, as indeed pimp states today who provide the legalization of prostitution really look after the sexual and psychological welfare of male citizens now. So there are some similarities between now and then, for sure. Now, the women who were prostituted were controlled by pimps. Pimping was seen as an ordinary occupation, as it is now. You know, running brothels is perfectly okay in places like Australia now. You know, and the women worked in absolutely horrendous conditions. They were all slaves, and they were likely to have been what were called barbarians, and they were likely to have been acquired in war. And the women in the brothels were the lowest rank of prostituted women, and they were called pornae, which is where the word pornography comes from. As Andrea Dworkin pointed out, pornography means writing about whores, which is the word that Andrea used. Now, there were other ranks of prostituted women, but it's likely that the vast majority at least started out as slaves. And a section of the prostituted women were called aulatrides, or flute players. And this group had the job of playing musical instruments and dancing at the symposia, which were these events which were prostitution and drinking parties that took place in the men's section of domestic homes, which, as Joe has explained, had a door to the outside. So the women of the house didn't actually have to see the prostituted women come in and see what was going on. The aulatrides would be sexually used after the music and dancing. And it was probably a slightly better life than being in the brothels. They could be rented to be at these events. Now, reading about these women reminds me of the situation of geisha in Japan, of course, where girls were sold into the brothels at about 7 years old by their families and trained to be entertainers, and their virginity was sold off to a long-term sponsor at 14, and then they continued in prostitution. The interesting thing, of course, is that geisha have been made into an extraordinary myth that they were just these wonderful entertainers who just did dancing. Of course, they were prostituted class, but it was common throughout Asia for the prostituted class of women, or a part of them, to be also dancers and entertainers, and they would entertain the men who were lying about drinking before they were sexually used. This was normal, and this was happening in Greece as well. They're the dancing girls of Lahore, for instance, who completely fit into that, and so on. Now, in countries where dancing and prostitution are seen as synonymous, as they were obviously in Greece and Japan and so on, respectable women were commonly not permitted to dance. An example of this is the prohibition on Muslim girls dancing in schools in the UK, for instance, because dancing is seen as simply not acceptable. So the situation in the majority culture in the West, of course, though, is that dancing is just a part of prostitution in strip clubs, for instance. Strip clubs is the dominant form of dancing and prostitution in the West. Now, the introduction of so-called gentlemen's clubs in the West in the 1990s may be connected, well, as I think it's probably connected, with the foreign travel and the globalization of the sex industry. So the Asian prostitution customs, such as from Korea and Japan and so on, came to the West. And we got this explosion of gentlemen's clubs in the 90s. Now, in the West, non-prostituted women may dance, but interestingly, more and more owners of strip clubs are introducing of nightclubs are introducing prostitution practices such as the showing of pornography, having dancers on show who do sexual dancing, and so on. So as I understand it, there's greater sexualization and molestation of female customers in nightclubs as they take on more of the mores of the sex industry. Now, the top class of prostituted women in Athens were the hetairae, some of whom may have achieved manumission and become freed slaves. These are the ones who are celebrated as being intellectuals. So there's a lot of writing about how, the upper class men had these very educated courtesans and what extraordinary culture they had and so on. Citizen women, remember, weren't allowed education. So some of these women may have achieved manumission, they may have become influential courtesans, but that's unlikely to have been the case for most, though some may have read poetry at the symposia and so on. Now, when the prostituted women were old, they would have to go to brothels, and they would be sent to brothels by their owners, and they became the lowest class of prostituted women. And it's interesting that some of the sparse paintings specifically depict elderly prostituted women showing droopy breasts and so on. So obviously, until they died, that was what they had to do. There are many more details about how the women survived that I don't have time to talk about. Now, some slave women within domestic houses were prostituted by their male owners, and they're called concubines in the book. Again, when the man was finished with them, he might send them to a brothel to live out their lives as prostituted women. Or the man could rent them out to brothels for the income. And I remember reading something about the history of what is now Indonesia, that men would simply rent out their female slaves to brothels for the income. I'm very interested always in the sort of similarities in cultural forms of prostitution and so on. Now, what was shocking to me on rereading the book was to come across the description of what symposia actually were, because of course I was teaching in a university where the term symposia is used for meetings that are supposed to be sort of highly valued, very intellectual and so on, whereas it's very clear from the book that they were just drunken prostitution parties. And what's extraordinary to me, the way that words can change their meaning. And words, obviously, that relate to the terrible behavior of men can be celebrated, whereas words that relate to the power of women, such as mistress, for instance, mistress of a household, just becomes a bit on the side. So the words relating to women commit verbicide downwards. Words relating to what men do go upwards, which I think is interesting. Now, another thing that struck me as I reread the book were the similarities with the situation of women, girls, and boys in Afghanistan. And in Afghanistan, of course, boy prostitutes dance before being used. It's a similar system similar to what is now the developing practice of drag kids in the West. And of course, in Afghanistan, women are secluded, not permitted education, and so on and so on. But there's interesting similarities and ways in which these customs come back and move into the West and so on, which I'm really interested in. Anyway, I'm going to stop there for now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that now we're seeing what Keuls is showing us. This should definitely be taught in schools as a never again story. We should not be told that the symposia are this great refined place that discussion happened, and Athens was the foundational sort of states, the start of Western democracy. We should be told about the scandal and the horror and the violence of the Athenian state in the 5th century, and taught this should never happen again. What can we learn from how they organize their structures to make sure that never happens again? Now, I said this to a classics teacher who I met and said, do you teach this? And he said, no, we don't teach it in classics. And I said, well, surely you should. And he said, oh, well, it would upset the pupils. yeah, it would upset the pupils, but it wouldn't be quite so upsetting if you said it in the light of this is horrific, let's not do it again. It would be very upsetting if you just said this is the reality and let's just carry on like this. So you can tell stories of horrors and say we're going to move away from them, but that isn't really happening. So unfortunately. Now, somebody in the chat said, did anybody speak out against this situation in Athens? And there were quite a few people who were speaking out against it. Now, Aristophanes, who wrote Lysistrata, which is about the sex strike by women, who they said, we don't want our men to go to war. We're not going to have sex with you. Now, Keuls quite rightly says it's a bit sort of ironic, because the women of the citizen class probably didn't enjoy sex anyway with their men. They probably didn't want to have sex with the men because it was such a horrific experience. But he was saying that he was giving women a voice, and he also wrote the Parliament of Women, and he wrote he wrote a lot, and he often voiced women's concerns and anger, and actually quite a lot of the male writers did do that. There were also quite a few who said that whilst they thought that women were weaker physically and they had to give birth, they were, to all intents and purposes, logical, capable of being educated, and that they should participate in public life. Now there's loads of evidence for that, and unfortunately I can't read you bits because I haven't got the quotes, but they're in the book, so if you want to have a look. But there were voices, and women had no names. They weren't named in this whole period, and they certainly didn't have a voice. So, but we do have voices coming through men, and quite often very good ones. There's also the whole bit of Greek philosophy which became the Stoics. The Stoicism is a sort of strand of Greek philosophy, and they were very much in favor of women's equality and sort of women, the capacity of women to be full human beings. So there have been strands of it. So on the opposite side, Aristotle was the most misogynist, vile man, and he's the one who's quoted a lot as the great philosopher. There were actually quite a lot of good Greek male philosophers. The other thing I want to say is there's a good quote that I've got about the theatre. So, and that's, I suppose, links up to Aristophanes. They don't know if women attended performances, but they do know that women didn't play in the theatre. And Keuls writes here, in life, men had reduced their women to shadowy creatures, cut off from most forms of social intercourse, their numbers thinned by childbirth, their health undermined by disregard for their medical and nutritional needs. It's known they had worse food. On the stage, these men impersonated, out of the dimly remembered ancestral past, powerful, fearful, fearsome woman, driven by superhuman passions, a Clytemnestra exulting over the slain bodies of her husband, and Cassandra, and Antigone braving death in her defiance of the law, and Agave coming on stage brandishing the severed head of her son on a stick, all impersonated by men. So the women weren't allowed out to theatre. Then just bringing it back to this, the situation that she posed at the beginning of this, who mutilated the Hermes. I'll just explain about what she, every August, the women of Athens had a festival of Adonis. And in the Adonis festival, they had a few days when the women were allowed out of their box-like prison type places, and they could go up onto the roofs, and they partied, and they had songs and rituals, and they called out also that they celebrated Adonis, who was the kind, gentle, this is a mythological god, lover. So he was everything that their men were not. He was sort of had empathy, and he was kind, and they actually found him attractive. So he's a very important part. During that festival of Adonis, the women were able to meet. They had big parties. They were allowed to roam around the city a little bit. And they were also allowed to, in this year, 415 BC, the women were probably allowed to roam around more because there was they were making a preparation to invade Sicily. So there was probably a bit more chaos. And so we were in this sort of situation of counter culture that's, in fact, Keuls quite often argues that the women did protest and there was counterculture, and so the festival of Adonis was an opportunity for protest against the sort of phallic regime. So back to you, Sheila.
Thank you, Jo. Can we just put up the images from the Anthony Gormley one?
Yeah. Oh, here we are.
Ah, here we are. Yes.
Oh, sorry. No. There we are. That's it.
That's it. That's it. Okay. It's just an interesting point that in the last couple of weeks, there's been a bit of controversy because the sculptor, the man Anthony Gormley, who's a very, very famous sculptor in Britain. He created some huge naked man standing on the coast somewhere in the north of England. And anyway, this is his plan for a sculpture somewhere in Oxford, or I think
it's in Imperial College. It's London.
It's Imperial College, is it not Oxford? Yes. Now the students at the college say that they don't want his sculpture, his statue, because it is phallic. Now they obviously understand it to be, although the newspaper articles about it do not say this specifically, but the students, the clever students, have obviously recognized that it is a herm. You notice that it has a head, and it has something protruding. Now, Anthony Gormley says that what is protruding towards the bottom of the body is knees. The man is sitting on, he's squatted on the soles of his feet, and his knees are sticking out. Well, actually, his feet are flat, and it seems very clear to me that the students are correct, that it is indeed a herm, and Anthony is wrong. So Imperial College, it looks like, is going to get a herm, and the students see it, but the Guardian did not. So that's quite interesting. Anyway, back to what we've been talking about, and
yeah, I mean, we're coming towards the end, so maybe
yes,
I'll show women the last slide that we prepared. So this answers the question. This is Keuls' theory about who castrated the Hermes, and I suppose it's brought to current view of who might castrate Anthony Gormley's herm, maybe. But what she says is nobody found out. It's been a mystery. Everybody said they didn't know who castrated the Hermes on the night before the Athenians sent off a massive army or a fleet to attack Sicily. And her theory, I'll read out what she says. She says, and this is in the context of women knowing a good way to fight back, because these images of a maenad is a mythological female creature attacking the genitals of a satyr in a ritual. So it was one step from the enacted aggression against the genitals of satyrs in the controlled setting of cultic proceedings. So people did it for sort of party things or cults, to the castration of the phallic stone symbols at the prompting of fear and outrage. Among the many evil omens which were later said to have accompanied the expedition, there was one strange echo of the castration riot. According to Plutarch, an unidentified man leapt onto the altar of the 12 gods in the agora and cut off his genitals with a stone. Right. It is, of course, improbable, if my speculation is correct, that in time the truth would not have leaked out. The hypothesis that women were responsible provides the most likely explanation for the fact that this historical mystery remained unsolved. The truth was too shocking to acknowledge. By the time suspicions about the identity of the culprits, that's who castrated the Hermes, began to filter through, so many heads had rolled that it would have been impossible to point the finger at that theoretically non-existent class, the citizen women. So the point she's making is that they couldn't have blamed women for castrating the Hermes, because they were theoretically non-existent people, which I think's great. And she's clearly made a very good case that it probably was them. Right, so back to you, Sheila, for a couple of final words.
Yes, there is a great deal that could be said, and really I can only say again that the great thing about the book for me is that the overturning of all the great myths about Athens. Something that I didn't particularly mention was I found the discussion about sexual practice interesting in the book, because the main homosexual practice in the book was intercrural, that is between the thighs, because the boys they were dealing with were of the citizen class, and they used that with the prepubertal boys. They didn't do anal intercourse because it was seen as a subordinating practice used with slave women or prostituted men and boys. Now, it's fascinating to me because until the sexual revolution, it does seem that the most common forms of sexual practice among gay men in the West were oral sex, possibly intercrural, but not anal. And it's puzzling then that Athens is seen as the very pinnacle of sexual practice and a wonderful period. And it's also, of course, now that anal intercourse is absolutely dominant, became dominant in the sort of 60s and 70s in gay male culture. Anyway, that's the only thing that I didn't say that I thought was worth saying at this point, but there's just so much that's interesting. But lovely to be with you again after this break.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I mean, I feel the same. That there's so much that's good in this book. Just really recommend everybody read it and get it for Christmas for all your friends. It's just mind-blowing, and she's writing at the height of her powers. It's a joy to read. This Eva Keuls is you get the feeling she knows everything about Greek philosophy, culture, everything that happens, and it's just a joy to read it. So apart from the fantastic feminist analysis, and then these links that Sheila's made now with today's reign of the phallus that we're in, it's a brilliant book to read. Okay, well, I'm not sure what we've got next week, but we've got something. We'll send out invitations to everyone who's here and in the normal channels. Thank you so much, Sheila, and thanks everyone who's coming. We've had 100 women here today, so it's brilliant.
Thanks very much.
Okay, see you next week, everybody. Bye.